blanket the Australian state of New South Wales, transforming day into night.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels,
The federal
upon
government
the
is cracking
levers.
down on eco-terrorism and being followed closely by the state. For the second time in the week, a young immigrant child has died while in custody of the U.S.
I'm here to help protect our water for our future generation. We come here to die. We have to.
Hey friends, I'm Arnold Schroeder, and this is Fight Like an Animal, the podcast where we talk about the dispersal behavior of common ravens and how it predicts the outcomes of conflicts between mystical and orthodox sects of Christianity in the early first millennium. No joke, that connection specifically we are going to make. Not this time, but we'll lay some of the foundation, and if everything goes according to my admittedly kind of vague, kind of tentative plan, it'll be like episode 4 where we get there. And then, you know, if you're feeling like the internet isn't living up to its mandate of providing you with a constant stream of bizarre characters making unlikely claims, you can always think back and be like, well, you know, there's that one guy on the internet who claims that the behavior of ravens predicts conflicts in the early church. Or, you know, who knows? Maybe you'll think it's massively insightful and completely agree. I did get a ton of really interesting, worthwhile feedback on the first one of these that I did, and I thought that was, I mean, you know, like, it by no means had a vast reach, and I can't really claim any kind of disappointment for that because I didn't do any of the things that one would necessarily do to disseminate something far and wide. I'm trying to build this up gradually, but for the number of people who were exposed to it, the ratio of like really interesting, worthwhile feedback that I got, I thought it was kind of amazing. And, you know, I've quickly really come to this conclusion that I just really like doing this. And absent some massive disincentive that I can't really anticipate will continue, it's turned out to really just be the right format to disseminate and talk about a bunch of stuff that has been clattering around in my head for a really long time that I just didn't feel like I had a good format for. And, you know, like, in terms of the reach, I guess I did want to say, at the outset, I really did know that I was doing something that was not intended for an audience that was already organized into any kind of, like, cohesive subculture or information sphere on the internet, or you know, like, shared any particularly well-developed frame of reference or anything like that. And so that makes promoting this and disseminating this much, much harder. It would normally be, you know, like, I can think of the landscape of political podcasts out there is compelling and something that I'm familiar with. But, you know, like I was saying in the last episode, there are just some really major divergences that I have with kind of like a lot of the really core assumptions that underlie the behavior and the analysis of people who, like, consciously and explicitly identify as, like, activists and are involved in social political movements. And, you know, it's like, I really do honestly anticipate, as much as I, of course, will do the obvious work of, like, trying to disseminate my material within the networks that kind of exist in the existing landscape of political media. Sure, totally. But I really do anticipate that there will be some kind of significant resistance to a lot of what I'm saying among who would otherwise be my natural allies and who, throughout the course of my political organizing career, have been, you know, like my closest, like, compatriots. And so, like, I guess I would just say I think that I used to do, like, you know, a fair number of media trainings for different groups doing different kinds of political campaigns. And I'd always say, like, as much as it's just so painfully obvious, it feels kind of, like, ridiculous to articulate it, I'd always say, like, you really do have to know who you're trying to communicate with and what you're trying to say to them and what you're trying to get them to do. And for me, the who I'm trying to reach in this case is this, like, pretty amorphous entity that's really just, I think that honestly the primary sense I have of who the audience is like people who share some sort of set of, like, intuitions and moral priorities and reactions to the world that I do, who feel like they would like there to be really vital social movements doing really impactful things, and they could, like, really see why that would be a necessary good thing. But when they try to mentally model getting up the energy to, like, go to some meeting or some protest or whatever, they just hit this wall where they're like, I really can't imagine that doing any good at all, right? So to me, like, I'm just making these core claims that the way that social movements function don't work, and the deep assumptions underlying them are flawed. And I think that, like, some of where I'm coming from is just, like, an observation over the years that there are people out there who would be natural allies who are just so alienated and skeptical of, like, alienated from and skeptical of the political landscape per se as it exists. And those are the people I'm trying to reach. But that is a very, like I said, like a very amorphous construct. That's not something that there is an existing Facebook group about, really. That's not something where I can, like, hop into some network of existing podcasts and do interviews with their shows. That's not, like, it's just not, I don't have the communications infrastructure that one would ideally have to disseminate something. So the point that I am rather laboriously making is, if you're moved by this, if you feel like this is, like, if you're like, yeah, this actually feels like it's describing realities of the world that I've had some, like, you know, that, like, correspond to, like, thoughts that I've had and reactions that I've had, but it seems like, you know, this is, like, way more rigorous or, like, developed, and, you know, and I think it's really interesting, and who knows what possibilities it have. I just say, like, please, if you can think of, like, one person who might be interested in getting an email about this show. Obviously, if you use social media and you feel like you could share anything at all that you can do to help me build a network is vastly and eternally appreciated. And you can find a bibliography for this show, the last show, all the shows that I'll do at a little website that I have. It's called againsttheinternet.com, because I make clever little jokes like that. And I'm excited to do this one. This time we're going to really talk about all the science that I read purely for, like, the thrill of inquiry, right? So, like, last time, I think that landscape of scientific findings is so fascinating, but I definitely did read it all in the framework of a hypothesis, right? I read it to answer questions that I had. And this is the stuff that I just read because I thought it was so amazing. And so, you know, like, last time we talked about how some form of political conflict that can be called right-left is a cross-culturally durable phenomenon. That cultures with radically different economic backgrounds and cultural histories and, political and material conditions do consistently manifest a form of political conflict that can be called right-left, and that the right-left divide is correlated with a pretty idiosyncratic, complex set of traits, a pretty mysterious, or at least not thematically cohesive set of, for instance, core psychological orientations and kind of perceptual priorities and degrees of fearfulness and differences in brain structure and physiology and cognitive performance and all these other things. And this time, we're going to talk about biology in other species. This will be an episode where we talk about humans relatively little. And we're going to talk about biology in other species that appears to be describing, to me anyway, appears very much to be describing variation in precisely the same set of idiosyncratic traits. And last time I talked about how one of the core distinctions involved in the right-left divide that is acknowledged, but I don't think is described and discussed as prominently and centrally as is warranted, is variation in aggression. Right, so the right exhibits a greater tendency towards aggression in all these different ways. And that can be in terms of political objectives, like support for wars, the tendency to start wars, support for the police, the tendency to be police, support for the death penalty, support for greater rates of incarceration. And that's also true in terms of how the right contends for power, right? So in terms of right-wing activists actually kill people in the United States, and left-wing activists just haven't been doing that any time in recent history. The phenomenon of militias is almost exclusively a right-wing phenomenon, right? So there's all these senses in which there's a clear asymmetry in aggressive tendencies between the right and the left. So in a bunch of different species with very different evolutionary backgrounds, species that aren't necessarily closely related to each other at all, variation in aggression correlates with variation in a number of other traits. There's a bunch of them, but one really fundamental theme that biologists consistently talk about is behavioral plasticity versus behavioral rigidity. So animals which are less socially tolerant, therefore more hierarchical, more aggressive, are also less prone to exploring new geographical areas, pursuing new stimulus, and just generally exhibiting behavioral flexibility. So, one could say, to revert to the terminology of political psychologists that we described in the last episode, one could say that many species have reliably clustered attitudes towards inequality and attitudes towards change. And the first thing to talk about with these trait variations is where they come from, how they emerge, because it'll be pretty essential to understanding what they are and why they're consistently associated with one another. So the biology of aggression is very much wrapped up in evolutionary developmental biology, which is a very distinct form of evolutionary theory. I guess, who knows if this is particularly advisable, but it's what I'm going to do. I guess to use myself as an example, when I was 8 years old, I thought that ninjas were cool, and I didn't have hair on my chest, and I didn't talk to girls, right? And then when I was 14 years old, I thought that smoking cigarettes and talking about anarchy was cool, and I did have a little hair on my chest, and I hung out with girls. Right, so I was a radically different entity, behaviorally, cognitively, and perceptually, physically, you name it. I was different. But obviously I didn't undergo a series of random genetic mutations to transform from a child to an adolescent punk rocker. I was genetically different, or I wouldn't have been so different. But all of my cells had the same nuclear DNA sequence. So what was happening is that nuclear DNA sequence in all of my cells was being expressed differently. So a class of very powerful genes, regulatory genes, a subset of which are developmental genes, exist just to tell other genes when to be active or inactive and how active to be. So all genes, no matter what their functions ultimately are, the first step in performing those functions is that they code for a protein. All genes code for proteins, right? And so regulatory genes and developmental genes just tell other genes whether or not to code for proteins, and if so, how much of those proteins to code for. And so we can easily imagine a scenario in which, if the developmental regulatory genes that were involved in affecting the transition between my 8-year-old self and my 14-year-old self hadn't shifted their activity, if I maintained the gene expression profile of my 8-year-old self throughout the entirety of my life, I obviously would be a radically different entity than I am, right? I would be a different animal. And this is the science of evolutionary developmental biology. It's about how changes in the process of development create wholesale changes in the organism. And it can happen in any number of ways. So it can be, as in the example that we just gave, development can slow down, and juvenile traits, your youthful traits, can be retained into adulthood. And it can even, some species exist as essentially a larval form of their ancestral species, so it can slow down development a lot, right? Or it can speed development up so that even if the animal lives for the same, absolute number of years or the same absolute amount of time, it reaches a stage of development that's like, in some sense, they become biologically older than their ancestral species ever did. They reach a later stage of development than existed in the ancestral form. And then it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that evolutionary developmental biology exclusively changes the timing of development. There's just a whole vast array of really profound changes that it can affect. To give one example, so arthropods, or at least some arthropods, I'm not sure about all of them, but crustaceans and myriapods, some arthropods have many legs, 8 in the cases of like crabs and lobsters, I believe, and then myriapods have I don't know, many. And this is probably not because there were random gene mutations that coded for a little bit more of a leg one at a time, and these all somehow turned out to be fortuitous, and so eventually these creatures had dozens of legs. What probably happened is that developmental genes that are involved in producing the legs, involved in taking some little cluster of cells in the embryonic organism and saying, you are legs now, go forth and become a leg. Those developmental genes either got copied more times or just did their work more times, but that whatever the case was, that program, that developmental program that they initiate and govern just happened more times at some in the life of one individual during its development somewhere in evolutionary history, and then that change just remained fixed in the species. So you can see how this is a scenario where a very radical change could come about in a species in the course of just one generation. And it wouldn't necessarily have to involve a random mutation. It could just be the gene doing something different, like acting differently than it had typically in the past. So there's two really significant ways that evolutionary developmental biology is very different from other kinds of evolutionary scenarios and that are important to our discussion. So one of these is clustering, trait clustering. Developmental genes control the activity of many genes. They affect many traits. So if there's some selective pressure for a trait to change, and the means by which that selective pressure is accommodated is a change in a developmental gene's activity and how it regulates the organism, it's going to most likely not just change the trait under direct selection. There's probably a bunch of other shifts that are going to come along for the ride. Right, so that's important for this discussion, this notion that we should expect to see correlated sets of traits varying in a correlated manner. And then the other important thing to note about evolutionary developmental biology is this reality that the evolutionary change isn't necessarily coming about through random genetic mutations, but through the plasticity of the organism, through the behavioral, developmental, phenotypic plasticity of the organism. So there's a paper by someone named Mary Jane West Eberhard that was published in 2005 about this type of evolutionary theory. I'm going to read a little quote from it that makes this point. Because selection acts on phenotypes, not directly on genotypes or genes, novel traits can originate by environmental induction as well as mutation, then undergo selection and genetic accommodation. Skip a little bit, but then insofar as phenotypic novelties arise from adaptive developmental plasticity, they are not random variants because their initial form reflects adaptive responses within evolutionary history. So this is core to what we're talking about for a variety of reasons. When we're talking about this type of biology, when we're talking about the right-left divide, the ultimate questions are always going to be, if there's a biology of the right-left divide, what is the capacity for variation within that biology? Because obviously societies are capable of variation, right? There are radically different experiences of politics and political realities that are attested within the human record. So obviously there's some capacity for variation, but there is obviously also a biology of these types of the politics that characterize human societies. So this one really core question is, what is the range of variation that we're capable of? And where does that variation come from? And under what circumstances will we exhibit one or the other kind of variation? Right, and then another really important point here is that when we talk about this type of biology, when we talk about the biology of the right-left divide, we're not talking about, we're talking about sort of like behavioral, perceptual, biological programs that actually exist in all of us, and that we access under different environmental conditions. We access like a variable set of these innate programs that live within all of us, depending on our thresholds for them in different environments. And that's what the right-left divide is in this hypothesis that I'm presenting. It's not genetic differences that inexorably, fixedly just lead us to totally different perceptual orientations. It's actually just a range of thresholds for invoking different behavioral perceptual paradigms that are there in all of us. And, like, I guess one way you could think about this is to just think about, I don't know if you ever play the game where you think about radically different cultures, where there was some fairly institutionalized form of behavior that you just kind of can't imagine yourself doing. But that if you lived in that culture, if you're being honest with yourself, unless you're like a very, very, very rare specimen of humanity, you would have accessed some set of perceptual coordinates and some set of behavioral imperatives that you may really have trouble imagining exist in you, but they're there somewhere. And that's what we're talking about with the biology of the right-left divide. We're talking about behavioral paradigms which are latent or expressed, but that exist in all of us. And we're talking about variation in thresholds for accessing those paradigms. Okay, so variation in aggression is thought to emerge from developmental processes because less aggressive animals retain more youthful traits for later into life. They exhibit developmental delay, which is also called by biologists a lot of the time neoteny. Neoteny is the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood. And this is true both physically and behaviorally. The phenomenon was first observed in domestic animals. It's essentially what domestication is on some level. It's a reduction in aggression in animals such that they can be kept with each other in population densities that they wouldn't tolerate and that their wild ancestors wouldn't tolerate. And it's a reduction in aggression such that they're amenable to human contact to some degree necessary to be what we think of when we think of domestic animals, to be managed in some sense or another. So, animals were domesticated all over the world, and they're not like all closely related. They come from really different evolutionary backgrounds, but they all exhibit some of the same traits. First of all, they all exhibit levels of aggression towards one another and their human handlers that are characteristic of juveniles in the wild species they were domesticated from. And then they also share a bunch of similarities in their basic appearance. There's a famous schematic by Konrad Lorenz that illustrates this. Konrad Lorenz was a 20th century animal behavior scientist. So he shows a human face and then the face of a human man and the face of a human child. And you see these typical distinctions between them. So the child has like a shorter, like more rounded nose. It has bigger eyes, more rounded eyes, proportionally to its face, like a less jutting brow, bigger ears proportionally to its head. And then it shows a series of domestic animals and the wild animals they were domesticated from, and you can see the same distinctions. You can see how dogs, with respect to wolves, have much shorter, snubbier noses. They have big, cute, round eyes. They have adorable, big floppy ears in a lot of cases. But this is also, it's not just dogs and wolves. It's like bovines. It's cows versus the wild species they're domesticated from. This is even true. It's not even just restricted to mammals. This is also true in birds and fish. And so, because this phenomenon was first studied in domestic animals, this phenomenon of aggression being correlated with a number of other traits. It's sometimes called the domestication syndrome. So animals which are less aggressive are more behaviorally flexible because youth is fundamentally associated with behavioral flexibility, right? They retain juvenile traits into adulthood, and behavioral plasticity is a juvenile trait. This is something we don't really need to navigate too much cryptic biology of to have a pretty intuitive sense of, at least within our own species, right? We know this from our own experience. We know that older people vote more conservatively than younger people. If you've been alive for any length of time, you've probably had some version of this experience in your own life. Like youth is very much the phase where you are sort of just pursuing stimulus and novelty for the sake of doing so. You're just having experiences, and you're like, and it's way more characteristic of youth than it is of old age to be in a stage of your life where you're kind of like waking up and you're like, what's happening today? Who knows? Let's see what the adventure is. Hey guys, what are we doing? Oh, we're going to this city? Well, all right. That's way more characteristic of youth than old age. And so, like we kind of know that youth and behavioral flexibility are fundamentally, intimately associated. And this is also very true in other species. And there's a bunch of different ways that we could kind of like approach that reality. We could talk about the dispersal behavior of many species, how in many species there comes a phase in adolescence where they leave the birth group that they occupied for the beginning of their lives, and they kind of go into like a wandering phase for a while, and then eventually they get assimilated into some other group. Or we could talk about play. We can talk about how play is pretty like patchily but broadly distributed throughout a bunch of different species, and it's definitely animals trying out all these different variations on what will in adulthood become much more rigid, stereotyped behaviors. And just like generally, again, without really sounding terribly educated to do it, like we can make these sort of like the general point that animals are more behaviorally flexible when they're younger, because in some very real sense they are learning to become the animals that they will someday be. And so it's a time when they're just sort of trying out behaviors, and then eventually they will develop a sort of more rigid repertoire of those behaviors that they experiment with, and those will be the like characteristic adult behaviors. But like one particularly interesting salient window into this reality of youth and behavioral flexibility is a phase that goes by a few different names. It's called the sensitive period of adaptation, or the critical period. The critical period precedes the development of the fear response, which is when animals start to become wary of unfamiliar animals and therefore aggressive towards them. So some researchers selectively bred foxes for reduced aggression and talked about how the critical period in them didn't end for much later, right? So they bred them for reduced aggression, but they produced a general developmental delay in the process. And so this is from a 2004 paper that some of these researchers wrote. I'm going to read a little quote. The sensitive period of such adaptation, or primary socialization, is known to begin in the early postnatal development by functional maturation of sensory systems and locomotion. Owing to that, the animals can perceive the environment and respond to it. The development of the fearful response is regarded as a factor that substantially complicates, if not altogether blocks, the processes of their exploration of the social environment and adaptation to it. And then later on, when they talk about the phase where the critical period ends and the fearful response has developed, they say of these foxes, our experiments have shown that this age is characterized by a reduction in exploratory activity in a novel environment. Okay, so this is not just true of, this research was about foxes, but this is the critical period, the sensitive period of adaptation is something that's broadly distributed throughout the animal kingdom. So in their experiments, wild foxes have a critical period that ends after like about 45 days from birth, and they manage to extend it to more than 3 months. But this is also true, this is also like the same distinction that exists between dogs and wolves. So in dogs, the fearful response manifests in most dogs by 4 to 6 months. In some, it's as late as 8 to 10 months. But whereas in wolf pups, the critical period ends by like a month and a half or so. So the first person to test the hypothesis that all the correlated changes seen in domestic animals were the result of one selective pressure, a selective pressure against aggression, right? That humans were really just concerned with being able to manage the animals that they were trying to domesticate, that they weren't thinking about all these other traits that domestic animals share, that they were just thinking, okay, well, how do we get these animals to be docile enough that we can handle them and, you know, like get them to go into a pen and get them to like be around each other in relatively great densities and all that. That, you know, that the selective pressure was purely for tameability. The first person to test that hypothesis was a Russian scientist named Dmitry Belyaev. And so he tested this hypothesis on these silver foxes that came from a fur farm. So they were captive foxes, but they were not domestic. They were still wild in the sense that they showed the same levels of aggression towards and fearfulness of humans as foxes that were living wild and free. And he took some relatively small subset of the population that exhibited less than typical levels of aggression, and he began selectively breeding them, allowing just the least aggressive animals in any given generation to reproduce. And the results were pretty striking. Belyaev's experiments have been the subject of at least one documentary, and certainly there's been a number of articles for a general readership about them. And, you know, they're so striking in many respects, but one is because of how much the foxes really do just resemble dogs. You know, foxes and dogs are both canines. And we've all been around a lot of dogs and witnessed a lot of dog behavior, and the extent to which these foxes' behavior so closely resembles that of dogs is like pretty uncanny and like pretty striking. So in just 4 generations, Belyaev managed to breed foxes that did not have aggressive or fearful reactions to humans. They were actually really favorable towards humans and really emotionally responsive to them. So they would whine and yelp for human contact when the handlers were walking by their cages. They would wag their tails at their human handlers and lick their hands. And then if they were let out, they would follow their handlers around just like dogs. So by 2004, these animals, this experiment, I think it's still ongoing. It certainly was ongoing. It was still continuing relatively recently. The experiment has outlived Belyaev. This started in the mid-20th century. By 2004, these animals comprised roughly 70% of this experimental population. Roughly 70% of them had this like essentially domestic behavioral paradigm. And Belyaev's hypothesis was confirmed by all these other changes that the animals underwent. They developed a distinct coat pattern that isn't seen in wild foxes, but that domestic animals from cows to dogs all have, It's called piebald, and it's just where little like spots of fur are depigmented on the animal's coat. And then these experimental foxes also have less difference in the size of their teeth and in the size of their skulls between the sexes than their wild ancestors, and greater similarity between sexes in size and a number of other respects is a characteristic trait of domestic animals. The animals in Belyaev's experiment also just got a lot more juvenile. These foxes look like dogs. They have shortened noses, they have big round eyes, and they have like big cute floppy ears. So these are characteristics that dogs have, but that wolves don't. And the juvenile wolves have them, but adult wolves don't. And then, they're characteristics that juvenile wild foxes have, but adult wild foxes don't. And then also, domestic animals exhibit a greater range of sexual behavior, and they have sex more often than their wild counterparts. And the experimental foxes also changed in this way. So the females started having 2 periods of sexual receptivity in any given year rather than the 1. And then this kind of like general experimental paradigm has also been carried out in mice, and the result was the same. So the mice were selectively bred for reduced aggression alone, no selective pressure for any other trait. But the less aggressive mice also exhibited general developmental delay in traits not directly related to aggression. So, like I said before, these correlated changes were first observed in domestic animals, and so the syndrome is called the domestication syndrome, but it does occur in wild species. And when it does, some researchers call it self-domestication, for better or for worse. But there's this great paper called The Self-Domestication Hypothesis. Bonobo Psychology is Due to Selection Against Aggression. It was written by Brian Hare and others and published in 2012. And it lays out this hypothesis for it lays out the hypothesis that bonobos are as they are with respect to chimpanzees because of selection against aggression. And then they present a hypothesis of why selective pressure against aggression occurred in the wild on bonobos. And so their hypothesis is that there was a chimp-like ancestor. By chimp-like, I mean more aggressive, with a more rigid dominance hierarchy. So, they're saying chimps are more like the common ancestor of chimps and bonobos than bonobos are in this respect. This common ancestor, or this bonobo ancestor rather, was isolated south of the Congo River about 1 million years ago, and that this place they ended up was just easier to get by than where they'd been. So there weren't gorillas to compete with for food. There was more abundant food. And the researchers think that this created the basis for a sort of feminist revolution. Female chimpanzees bear an incredible burden of aggression from males. They are sexually coerced. They are attacked by jealous males when trying to copulate with other males. Their general fortunes are just broadly determined by this really intense male hierarchy. But there is a trade-off for putting up with all this aggression, because males also maintain territories. Males of other territorial groups will form what researchers call border patrols. If you've ever read in any detail about this or watched a video of it or anything, it's like a pretty haunting phenomenon. Chimpanzees will get into a single file line and they'll like roll out all like real clandestine and real like intent looking, and they'll sneak into neighboring chimpanzee territories. And then if the group encounters, this is only like the adult males essentially that mostly ever do this. If they encounter a big group in this neighboring territory, there'll be some screaming and hollering, and then they'll eventually retreat. But if they encounter vulnerable individuals, just one or two individuals, they'll attack and often kill them. And this behavior has been observed in a few cases to just go on so intensely and frequently that it resulted in the outright extermination of a neighboring chimpanzee group and a territorial expansion by the chimpanzee group that was carrying out all the raids, or whatever you want to call them. And so female chimpanzees suffer but also benefit from the aggression of males within their group, because that aggression is key to surviving the aggression of males from other groups. But the researchers think that when life got easy for the ancestors of bonobos south of the Congo River, that the pressure for territorial aggression declined, and this really left less of a clear trade-off. It left less advantage to females tolerating the social aggression and sexual aggression that they'd been subject to. So they think that they started forming bigger female coalitions to thwart, to fight males who tried to beat them up or force sex or whatever. And so this, of course, produces a selective pressure against these kinds of acts of aggression. So what we see today is that there is no bonobo society ever documented in which the highest ranking member is male. And the levels of aggression characteristic of chimpanzee societies just really aren't there in bonobos. They're most famous for having a lot of sex, but this is in some, sex and aggression are really correlated traits, as we've been describing. But I think that this lack of aggression is actually, in some respects, maybe their most noteworthy distinction. Bonobos don't kill each other in territorial conflicts. There's a much less formal dominance hierarchy, a much less rigid dominance hierarchy with far fewer, far less formal exchanges of dominance cues. Dominance hierarchies are established by far less brutal violence. And then males just do not sexually coerce females in bonobo societies. And the mechanism by which selection against bonobo aggression is thought to occur is, once again, the same developmental pathways that shift aggression in domestic animals and bring a lot of juvenile traits along for the ride. And it's because bonobos do exhibit a developmental delay and a lifelong retention of juvenile features. They exhibit neoteny with respect to chimpanzees. Their skull shapes are like juvenile chimp skulls. They're dependent on their mothers for longer than chimps. They retain levels of social tolerance throughout their lives that are characteristic of juvenile chimps. Both chimps and bonobos do get less and less socially tolerant as they age, but this process is just so much faster in chimpanzees that they reach, a state of intolerance of one another that is much greater than bonobos ever get by the time adolescence is over. And then bonobos also have juvenile chimp-like abilities for behavioral inhibition. So in experiments where they are required to inhibit themselves from some behavior that they would be naturally inclined to perform in exchange for some reward or whatever, they can inhibit themselves about as well as juvenile chimps. So those are some interesting traits in terms of the right-left trait distinctions that we talked about before. Obviously there's aggression in there. Obviously there's sex. Obviously there's a little more novelty, a little more comfort with novelty. The bonobos, but not chimpanzees, sometimes have amiable interactions with members of other groups. And then these distinctions in terms of inhibition. So, if we think about how they not only don't kill members of other territorial groups, but they sometimes play and actually have sex with them, we can certainly say that bonobos are more open to new experiences than chimpanzees. And then, because they're less capable of inhibition, it's probably also fair to say that bonobos are less conscientious than chimpanzees. So here we're throwing around psychological terminology that in the last episode was used to characterize the right-left divide. So this same paper, which presents this hypothesis of the selective pressures against aggression that bonobos underwent, also just provides this really great summary of the changes that characterize the domestication syndrome in general, whether it's in domestic or wild animals. And they break these changes into 4 pretty broad categories. So first are physiological changes, and a bunch of these have to do with muted stress and fear responses, which once again we can think about last episode how we talked about the physiology of stress and fearful responses is very different between the right and the left. So animals under the domestication syndrome have a reduced reactivity of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, and less HPA activity implies less aggression. But then some of the physiological changes don't have much to do with aggression at all, like the changes in sexual receptivity that we talked about. Although, again, a right-left distinction. And then the second category is behavior. So animals under the domestication syndrome just generally behave in a more prosocial way. They retain repertoires of communicative behavior characteristic of their juvenile wild counterparts. They have more interactions, they play with each other more, they groom each other more often, they have more of what some scientists call affiliative interactions. And then they also engage in what the researchers call sociosexual behaviors. So that's to say, sexual acts which have no reproductive function. Sex for fun, sex for bonding. And the third category is anatomical, which we've already discussed. These are the changes, the lifelong retention of juvenile features, the depigmentation of fur, the diminishment of differences between the sexes. And then fourth, and finally, there's cognitive changes. There are ways in which animals under the domestication syndrome are better at solving certain classes of problem than their wild counterparts. They're better at interpreting social cues, both from humans and from each other. So like dogs and experimental foxes can follow cues involving gazing and pointing from humans that wolves and control foxes can't. Bonobos can solve cooperative problems with each other in ways that chimpanzees can't. Guinea pigs can navigate mazes better than cavies. Cavies are the wild ancestors of guinea pigs. So there's a bunch of cognitive changes, and at least in some, there are actually a bunch of trade-offs. It's a complex landscape, but at least in some cognitive domains, there's kind of an increased cognitive function associated with the domestication syndrome. So again, a trait distinction we talked about last episode in conjunction with the right-left divide. So, hopefully all this is sufficient to convince you that there's some biology with some pretty significant parallels to the right-left divide going on between chimpanzees and bonobos. And, many people have commented generally on this over the years. There's these distinctions of aggression and social tolerance, distinctions of novelty seeking, sexuality, etc. But for as much as these two species are our closest ancestors, and so it obviously does make a ton of sense to include them in this analysis, for any of this to be pertinent to the right-left divide, it has to be true that these kinds of developmental distinctions and aggression and its correlated traits could exist within a given species rather than just between different species. And there is a lot of good evidence for this in a lot of different places for innate variation in aggression and its correlated traits within a given species. So first of all, just to cover them, just to reference the material we've already covered, it's really worth noting that for the research like the fox experiment and the mice experiment to happen, there had to be some subset of these initial populations that showed less than typical aggression for them to begin selectively breeding from. And then I think a particularly interesting example is this somewhat famous case of the garbage dump baboons. Again, this is something that has definitely found its way into a fair amount of popular media at various points. There's a 2004 paper by Robert Sapolsky and Lisa Scher called A Pacific Culture Among Wild Baboons, Its Emergence and Transmission, which documents the case of a troop of savanna baboons whose dominant males all fed at a garbage dump next to a hotel. And it was only the dominant males. There's about half the entire population of males, and it was only the dominant males because the garbage dump was in another baboon's troop's territory, and so they had to fight to eat there. But, who can pass up all that high-quality garbage? And then there was an outbreak of this disease, bovine tuberculosis, from the dump, from food in the dump. And it killed 100% of this troop's dominant males. And then the researchers just describe all the changes that this troop underwent subsequent to the loss of its dominant males. Because what didn't happen is that the remaining males didn't simply occupy the vacant places in the dominance hierarchy. They produced a really radically different baboon culture. So the researchers assessed a bunch of different dimensions of baboon social organization that varied after these dominant males died. These are like rates of male-male aggression, rates of male-male approach-avoid interactions. So one baboon approaches a male baboon approaches another, and that baboon is like, yeah, I don't think this is going to go anywhere I like, and runs off. It's rates of aggression that males directed at females, but then it's not just aggression, it's also social behaviors like affiliative pro-social behaviors. So the number of seconds that males spent grooming females, specifically non-estrus females that they weren't trying to have sex with, just general affiliative behaviors, time they spent grooming each other, that males spent grooming each other, the proximity of females, adolescents, etc., to males in terms of where they slept. And they found some of these differences. In all these dimensions I just described, there were differences. Some of them were statistically below the thresholds of statistical significance. Some of them were statistically significant. But so this society was really different, and we can make a bunch of different inferences from this. Obviously, one is that there was some level of innate difference in aggressiveness and orientations to the dominance hierarchy that always characterized this society. That the males who were not prominent in the dominance hierarchy were not necessarily such simply because they were bad at aggression, but also because they were maybe just less prone to it, that they were just less interested on some level in the dominance hierarchy. Then the next thing that we can infer, because the next thing that happened is that this culture actually continued to stay like that even as savanna baboons have a life cycle where the males, when they are adolescents, leave their birth group and they go find some other baboon troop to assimilate into. So, we would expect pretty quickly as males from other groups, even if the males in this troop were all genetically prone to less aggression, we would expect as new males randomly just came into the population, that levels of aggression that are just characteristic of baboon societies in general would quickly resume. But that's not what happened. So this peaceful culture of baboons remained even as adolescents assimilated into it and grew up to become adult males. So the next thing we can infer is that, yes, there is some very significant variation in aggression and its correlated traits between individuals within savanna baboon populations, but that also these aggression and its correlated traits have a bunch of plasticity in their expression, that environmental conditions will greatly shape the degree to which those innate behavioral paradigms are accessed. So that's pretty interesting. And this could be for a couple different reasons. It could be that the juvenile baboons were responding to kind of like, I don't know, an explicit like cultural model per se that the less aggressive males were exhibiting. It also could be there. Just for a long time, there were less males than females in this troop. There was a very atypical gender ratio, and like a lot of baboon aggression is tied up in sex. So there was less of like a clear incentive for it. But or it could be a combination of those factors. But one way or the other, whatever the case may be, all of those scenarios do illustrate the same basic point, that there's this tremendous plasticity in behavioral plasticity in terms of aggression, even though it does clearly have an innate component. And then another great example of variation in aggression within a given species is this example of developmental cannibalistic developmental polyphenisms within tiger salamanders. So, like the baboon, in the case of the baboons, there's less and more aggressive animals, but they're not so radically behaviorally distinct that they get their own names. But tiger salamanders have this developmental process that some of them undergo if larvae are too densely populated. Some of them will grow radically bigger mouths than is typical for their species, and they'll just start eating the other larval tiger salamanders. So, that's an example of some very profound variation in innate levels of aggression to be found within a single species. And then certainly there's evidence among chimpanzees of differences in levels of innate aggressiveness. If you read a book like Jane Goodall's Chimpanzees of the Gombe, Patterns of Behavior, that's her big, I've never read any of her just works for a general audience or whatever, but this is her big textbook-esque scientific monograph on the chimps that she studied for so many years. And a lot of this text is wrapped up in statistical statements about different categories of behavior and stuff like that. But then a lot of it is really just her profiling the different animals as individuals. She had a very, very intimate knowledge of all of them and really different relationships with some. And it's extraordinary. There's just so much personality variation between them. And some of them that she describes are just really are A, less prone to aggression, and B, just kind of nicer, just more pro-social. And this is also something that there's this, it's really brief. It's a 7-minute documentary or something, and it is very absurdly called Rise of the Warrior Apes. But it documents one of the populations. It's the largest chimpanzee population that's ever been recorded, and then apparently as a corollary, it's also just the most aggressive. They're the most warlike chimps around, and so it documents they're one of the populations in which it's been observed that a chimpanzee group will essentially extirpate a neighboring group, kill enough of them that they have no remaining coalitionary strength, and then there'll be some left over, but they'll just eventually move into the territory and assimilate the remaining chimps. And those researchers talk about a chimp in that society. These are the Ngogo chimps. They talk about a chimpanzee in that society named Hare, and they make the quip that Hare is the nicest person at Ngogo. But he's a very different animal, and he is the only one of the males who doesn't participate in an aggressive act at one point, and who actually tries to offer help and succor to the target of that aggression. And then he also he was the first this corollary between social tolerance and aggression. He was the first to tolerate researchers following him around and just like being kind of generally close to him. And then the documentary ends with this pretty like heartwarming scenario where he adopts these orphan like adolescent or like little baby chimpanzees. It's real heart touching. Yeah, so that's hair. That's another great example of variation and aggression. And then, I don't know, I mean, you could probably say on some level, I don't want to make a non-rigorous statement, but yeah, I mean, on some level, variation and aggressiveness seems to be just sort of an innate reality of the very fact that there are dominance hierarchies, or else animals' places within those hierarchies would be exclusively determined by like their size or other aspects of their fighting ability, and that really isn't what we see. So that's another indication of variation in innate levels of aggressiveness within animals of a given species. You know, we've talked about, again, like we're talking about great apes and stuff like that because they're so closely related to us. It makes a fair amount of sense if our ultimate goal is to make inferences about human behavior. But my very favorite example of any of this comes in the form of common ravens, Corvus corax. And it's my favorite example for a number of reasons. Ravens are just really important animals to me. I got really like curious about the behavior of ravens and started spending a bunch of time with them in the forest when I was a teenager, and it was in the course of these observations that I kind of generally became aware that I would have a lifelong interest in behavioral biology. And it's also when I became aware that I would have a sort of lifelong orientation towards what in our culture is called environmentalism or whatever, even though that's not really like the construct I identify with the most. It's the easy way to say it. But then it's also my favorite example because honestly I just think that their behavior offers a closer, more explicit parallel to the right-left divide than can be found anywhere else. And this is because it's a really ravens are a species that are in chronic social conflict. And nobody's ever going to win this conflict. This conflict just characterizes the species. And it's a type of conflict that very much does play out along lines of animals that are both more hierarchical and aggressive as well as more behaviorally rigid, fighting animals that are more egalitarian and pro-social as well as more novelty-seeking and exploratory and behaviorally flexible. Right? So common ravens have these two different developmental phases after they leave the nest. So one lasts for as little as 8 months in some individuals, but in some individuals it never ends. And so that's another important distinction. It's the differences between them are clearly mediated by development. Ravens are in chronic social conflict between different developmental stages, but the developmental stages don't have any fixed temporal parameters. So some individuals just stay in this first post-fledgling stage their whole lives. And when they're in the first phase, they have like a pink mouth interior. When they're in the second phase, they have a black mouth interior. When they're in the first phase, they're wanderers, and when they're in the second stage, and they're unmated, and when they're in the second stage, they are territorial and they're mated. Right, so in this first phase, this vagrant phase, as it's often called, common ravens will travel extraordinary distances and inhabit just like a very, very wide range of different environments. You know, they will try the tundra, they will try the forest, they will try the beach, the city, whatever. And they sleep so they're constantly exploring and just like testing out novel stimulus. And then they're very, very tolerant of each other. They can sleep alone, but they often sleep in these communal roosts, these collective sleeping sites. And In a few cases in North America, these sites, there's like some fairly stable ones next to like big garbage dumps and stuff like that have thousands of animals. They're usually smaller than that. But ravens typically change roost locations every few days. And they're not just, so they're constantly interacting with new animals. They're constantly around other members of their species that they're not familiar with. But they're not just tolerant of each other. They actually cooperate with each other. They have this very mutualistic foraging strategy where ravens at a communal roost who know of the location of a significant food source will leave the roost and be followed by all the other ravens, and they will collectively feed. And the reason for this, the evolutionary pressure to do this, is because ravens in the other developmental stage, the later phase of pair bonding and territoriality, will attack any raven that they find in their territory. So mated ravens, territorial ravens, only really have affiliative interactions with their mates and with their offspring. They're hostile to all other ravens. And they're not just more prone to aggression than the vagrant ravens, they're also better at it. So it takes a fair number of vagrant ravens to defend themselves against the aggression of a territorial pair. So when they find a significant food resource somewhere, in order to defend themselves against, in order to be able to feed at it and defend themselves against the aggression of the territorial pair, they need to bring big numbers. So that's what they do. And then, when vagrant ravens find the nests of territorial ravens, they destroy them. Right? So you can see how there is like this chronic form of social conflict. This is just what characterizes ravens and has since time immemorial, and how it very much is a conflict within their species between like a xenophobic, aggressive behavioral paradigm and between a xenophilic, socially tolerant behavioral paradigm, and how this distinction, these like clustered perceptual behavioral distinctions, are very clearly mediated by developmental processes playing out within a single species. So I think that's a really, really compelling example of, like how raven politics really, really seem to mirror human politics in some very significant regards. And so that's like essentially where I'm going to stop for this time. And what we're going to do next time is we're going to talk about how these same developmental processes might have played a role in human evolution, and what the evidence is for selection against aggression in the human species, and how we might expect to see variation in this correlated set of traits emerge within the human species. And so we're going to talk about, we are going to do some of the talking about like, inferences about humans' distant evolutionary past. But we'll also talk about research that we can do right now, for instance, like in humans' brain gene expression profiles, or in differences in cognitive ability between humans and other great apes, which elements of cognition humans are particularly adept at, and which therefore indicates, like what elements of cognition might have been under particular selective pressure in the course of human evolution. So we'll talk about a bunch of that pretty fascinating biology. And then in that same episode, we're going to, it's like essentially then that I will truly make my case, even though obviously at this point I'm, I have kind of like given a very strong indication of what I'm trying to say. It'll be in the third episode where I truly make my case by going through a list of all of these features of the right-left divide as we encounter it, which are predicted by a theory that says that the right-left divide reflects variation in this type of biology that we're talking about. And, hopefully it's becoming apparent that this really isn't a morality tale, right? That I'm describing a basis for political conflict and dynamics of how political conflict might play out that don't emerge out of any particular emotional or psychological need that I possess. I'm not describing the world as I would like it to be. I'm also not indulging in some, in a mere catastrophism. I'm not just saying, everything is dire. It's just purely the empirical, it's purely just the empirical journey that it is. And it takes us to all these places where I feel anyway, I don't really have a clear right, wrong, yes, no kind of approach, avoid, perceptual response at all. Ultimately, if the right-left divide reflects some of the same differences that distinguish chimpanzees and bonobos, we're getting into this territory where it's well, what are we going to say? Is it chimpanzees or is it bonobos who are correct about how to organize society? And of course, that's just an absurd notion. They're just different ways to behave and to organize society. But again, because the world is ending, and right-left politics are what characterize human societies in this time of just such extraordinary crisis, these are hugely morally, existentially loaded questions, what is the basis of conflict, what is the basis of conflict, and ultimately, therefore, the biological basis of how we organize societies, and what possibilities exist out there. So I'm certainly not trying to rob it of all its many rich implications, but that is the ultimate purpose and meaning of approaching these questions, and it's the ultimate significance that they possess. But I'm just saying that I think that so many belief systems in politics and so many other domains, when you look at them, even give them just brief scrutiny, you can really see the psychological, that the conclusions that they make about how the world operates and why it is the way that it is, and what its potential future outcomes, its potential future configurations could be. You can really just, I think, see the clear psychological need, the clear cognitive bias that is present in constructing those scenarios. And so what I am saying is that I think a theory that one can really trust is one that doesn't feel like that. And hopefully, as we're progressing through this material, you're getting some, what I would hope, whether you agree or disagree, is that you would really be getting an impression that I didn't make this all up in order to meet some emotional need that I have, because I didn't. This is, like I said, this is the empirical journey as I've personally experienced it. And I think that until the next time I make one of these, I'd encourage people, like I said, I'll give my list of all the traits of the right-left divide that I think this type of biology predicts, but I've laid a fairly extensive framework out, and so I think that if you feel like you want to give it thought, you can probably think about experiences of political conflict that you've had, or just knowledge of political conflict that you have, and relate it to this biology. And I invite scrutiny always. I might be wrong. The only reason I'm presenting any of this is because I think it's right, but it's always absolutely possible that there'll be some information or just an analytical perspective that I'll encounter that'll make me realize that I'm wrong. I'm very excited about the possibility of being wrong always. So, I would just say, I would encourage people to think about political conflict as they know it within the framework that I've described, and see if it feels like it matches, if it's predictive, if it's that's the hallmark of a real scientific theory in certain respects, is whether it actually predicts something. see if it's congruent with what you know and experience. See if you can think of things that I haven't mentioned that the theory sort of, but that you know to be true about the world, that the theory kind of suggests would be true about the world. And then, like I said at the outset, but I suppose bears repeating one more time, I've decided that I completely love doing this, and I'm going to continue doing it. I do have this sense of significance about it. This isn't really what I'm doing instead of organizing. This is where I've just got to this place with organizing where I felt like it was clearly not useful. And I felt like the frames of reference and the basic paradigms we were employing were wrong. And, so like in many respects, this is my first step in some new political paradigm. And if you're compelled by the material that I'm presenting, I deeply, deeply thank you if you find it within your heart to share or disseminate it in any fashion. And I hope that you all are well. It is a wild ride in this world right now, and I will see you next time, friends. Thank you so very much for listening.